Welcome everyone to today's presentation, Level Up Your Feedback, Single Point and Holistic Rubrics. Presenting today are Dr. Linda McCauley and Dr. Kim McLeod from the ETI. We're going to go over the following goals today. I'll give you a moment just to review them. All right, well, with that, we're going to get started. And we thought we'd start today's presentation on rubrics with a definition of rubrics themselves. So we're going to take a look at this definition and then dig into a couple and highlight a couple words from it a little bit more specifically. A rubric is typically an evaluation tool or set of guidelines used to promote the consistent application of learning expectations, learning objectives, or learning standards in the classroom, or to measure their attainment against a consistent set of criteria. And so, as I said, we're going to dig in just to a couple of the words here that we've highlighted. The first that we've highlighted is evaluation, because at its core, a rubric is an evaluation tool. We hope that you leave today maybe with an understanding that evaluation may or may not be that more traditional like grade or score. It could look a little bit different. So hopefully you leave today with a bigger understanding of what evaluation can look like. The next word we've highlighted is consistent. The rubrics provide really for instructors and for students consistency. Once you have that rubric created, then you're able to just start, very consistently evaluating each, paper or project, whatever it is. And then in turn, students get that consistency across all their assignments. They're receiving that consistent feedback. It could even be extended further if you were to take, say, a rubric from one assignment and revise it to make it fit another assignment. Now you've got consistency across assignments as well. So they certainly bring that to the table. And then last off, we've highlighted learning expectations, objectives, and standards. You'll hear us say many times today that rubrics contain criteria, multiple criteria by which students are measured. And so as we're building rubrics, it's important to think about what am I using to create that criteria by which students are measured. The criteria might come from, standards from the Medical Association, or they might come from, a textbook or a text that you use. They might even come from your expertise. But that's something important to keep in mind is where am I going to get the standards by which I'm measuring students, those criteria. And this is really a key point here about rubrics is that they can be used to evaluate anything. You could, if you wanted to, make a rubric to evaluate, the taste of the last meal that you had at a restaurant, for example. But more specifically, for instruction, they can be used for really anything from a paper to an exam and everything in between, projects, presentations, discussions. A lot of instructors actually, including myself, find it really useful to use a rubric for class participation, which can really look different across, different settings and what the expectations are for that. And then creating a rubric for that gives students a really clear idea of if I miss a class, what is it that I'm expected to do? And how many times am I expected to, raise my hand or post in the discussion board? And that can all be really outlined nicely through a rubric. So the big takeaway here is that rubrics are incredibly flexible. Hopefully you see that today. They can be used in many different ways for many assignments and really customized to fit what you need. So we are going to talk about some of the benefits of rubrics. Before we do that, I'm going to give you a little analogy here. And you might have noticed the name of this, the title of this presentation is Level Up Your Feedback. So we do have kind of a sprinkle of a light gaming theme going on throughout this presentation today. And it will start here with this game analogy that I'm going to give you. If you think about if you've ever played a video game or been, around someone that when they've played, you might notice that games always have this kind of built-in scoring system. So at the end of like a round or a level, they give you some kind of feedback on how you did. That then is something that you can use to do better in the next level or try that level again and see how you can improve. And really, that is what a rubric can do for students in a classroom, right? It gives them information about how they did and how they can continue to grow. and it's really the power that rubrics have. So thinking through some of the benefits of rubrics then, they do define for students how to be successful in the course, in the setting, on the assignment. Probably our students have completed papers throughout their educational careers, but how can they be successful specifically on the paper in your course for this subject matter, for this level of course? And a rubric really gives students that roadmap to show them how it is that they can do that. Next up, something that rubrics may have but may not have, and we'll kind of show what that looks like with and without, is that they might have different levels of achievement. So some rubrics might just tell students, here's exactly what you need to do to be successful. Whereas other rubrics might say, here's how to be successful, but if you do this, then you're below the expectations. And if you do this, then you've exceeded the expectations. And so that's something that can be built in depending on if, the instructor feels that that's a good fit for the assignment. Rubrics do provide very specific and customized feedback to the performance. That feedback could be, a score, a grade. It could be circling a box. It could also be more like a narrative feedback, written feedback to provide notes about everything that kind of went right or not, or needs some work in the assignment. So feedback is guaranteed. The type of feedback might differ depending on the rubric type. Rubrics are also incredibly motivating for students. I mentioned, I think that they are like a roadmap for how to be successful. So by giving students that roadmap, it kind of gives them their way to set goals for what they want to do, how they want to do it, and hopefully then it's more successful for them and they can take more from the course. And then lastly, and I think really importantly here with rubrics, is that they allow for students to make adaptive inferences about what they need to do for the next time. So, they get this feedback and, they get their grade and that's it sometimes, with assignments. But with a rubric, they can see specifically, what it is, where things went right, where things maybe didn't go as right, and how they can change that for next time so they can not just perform better on the rubric and in their score, but also maybe learn more and get more from the course and extend their knowledge further. All right, well, in a moment, I'm going to hand things over to Dr. McCauley to take you through those 3 different types of rubrics we're going to be talking about today. But before we do, I mentioned that we have that kind of sprinkling of a gaming theme throughout today's presentation. And that includes, toward the end, we're going to play a game. It's very low stakes. Don't panic. Don't worry. But the name of the game, as you can see on the screen, is Rubric Rockstar. It's really a simple quiz game. You're just going to see some pictures of rubrics, and we're going to see if you can figure out what type of rubric they are. You'll get all the information, so you'll feel prepared for it. But I mention this now because as Dr. McCauley is presenting the 3 types of rubrics, she's going to give you examples of rubrics that we created for our game, Rubric Rockstar. And she's going to give you those examples to show you, here's an example of what this type of rubric looks like. Here's an example of this one. And then we're going to revisit those examples later to give you a bit of a bird's eye view about how we ultimately selected the rubric that you would use to evaluate yourself in our game. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. McCauley to talk through the different types of rubrics.
We're focusing on 3 different types of rubrics today, analytic, single point, and holistic. We're going to spend the majority of our time focusing on single point and holistic because we have already done a full hour brown bag on analytic rubrics, and we're going to post that link to the YouTube recording of that session that we did in the chat for you if you'd like to go deeper into analytics. So we'll review a little bit, but we're going to go mostly into single point and holistic today. Any of these 3 types of rubrics can be effective, as Dr. McLeod mentioned, for any assignment. And it really just depends on your goal and amount of time that you have to provide the grading or feedback to your students. So as we start with our quick review of analytic rubrics, if we think about this gaming theme that we're using today to describe our rubrics and anchor this, it's really similar to a detailed post-game report in some of the modern role-playing games. It might break down your performance in the game across various categories. It might assess your combat efficiency, your exploration thoroughness, the resource management skills, or completion time for specific objectives in a particular game that you might be playing, for example. If we use a particular game to go along with our Rockstar theme, we're going to use Guitar Hero, which I think a lot of people have seen people play, or maybe you have played yourself. And if you think about some of the advanced Guitar Hero settings, that does offer you a detailed breakdown of your performance in the game. It allows you to see your accuracy for each section, how well you sustained long notes, and how effectively you used your star power. And this is really analogous to an analytic rubric that we might use to assess learning because it dives deep into very specific criteria. So, for example, in a presentation, you might assess areas like the introduction, quality, clarity of your arguments, proper citation usage, or slide design. Think about this. Have you ever designed an assignment where you wanted to explicitly provide specific feedback and level of performance on individual criteria? If so, an analytic rubric might be a good fit for that assignment. Here is an example of an analytic rubric for our game that we considered. So if we look at this rubric, you'll notice some of the elements that make it an analytic rubric are that we have criteria across the far left column: accuracy, rubric elements, and analysis of rubric. And then we have levels of performance across the top of mastery, proficient, and developing. And then within the grid, there are specific descriptions of what it means to be at each of those levels for each of those criterion that we're assessing. To make it an analytic rubric, it does have to assess at least 2 different criteria. In this case, we have 3. And you do need multiple levels of performance. In this case, we also have 3 levels. Comments on this type of rubric are optional. So you can see in this rubric, we did not leave a space to write written feedback or comments, but you certainly could do so if you wanted to, either for each criterion or also globally across the entire assignment. So just to recap, an analytic rubric has at least 2 criteria, has multiple performance levels that are either qualitative or quantitative, and you have separate scores for each of the criterion, and it's all in a grid. So if you see that, that's a hint that it might be analytic. Here is an example from literature. We realize that the text is tiny for this, so we're not going to make you read the whole thing, but we do want to make sure you notice some of the elements that make this analytic. So we're going to kind of zoom in on one portion of this rubric so that you can see there is a criterion of the radiographic record along the far left, and then the levels of performance are unsatisfactory, needs improvement, or meets expectations is the part we're showing. There's even more, but we just zoomed in a little bit. And you'll also notice in this particular rubric that they assigned points for the levels. So you can see unsatisfactory has 0, needs improvement has 0.25, and then meets expectations is 0.5, and the rubric continues on for the outstanding level to actually earn a point if you get that. And then they also gave some space for comments in that score as well. It is an analytic rubric because it has that grid, and hopefully you can see the usefulness of that if you wanted to be very specific. The next type of rubric that we're going to focus on today is called single point. And if we go back to our gaming analogy for a moment, imagine a simple arcade game, think my generation here, where you get a single point for completing a level. It doesn't matter how many enemies you defeated, how many coins you collected, how many dots you gobbled up, or how quickly you finished. You either completed it or you didn't. If we go with our Guitar Hero example that we used before, in this case, the Guitar Hero has a simple pass-fail mode. So you either strum through the entire song without missing any of the notes, which would be success, or you fail if you miss too many. This is similar to a single point rubric that only considers completing the basic task. So think about this. Have you ever just needed to give students feedback on whether they passed or failed an assignment? If so, a single point rubric might be a good fit. So for our rubric rockstar example for single point, you can see here that we have at least one criteria again that we are assessing. They're the same three that you saw in the analytic, but now the descriptor is just describing the proficient level. So this is the passing level. If you're below this, you fail. If you're above it, it's honors. It doesn't describe how to exceed or fall below those expectations. It just tells you the expectation. And then there's a space for comments so you can provide feedback to the person about how they did on that particular item that you are assessing. So to recap, a single point rubric describes only the proficient level of performance and does not describe how to exceed or fall below. And the feedback that you provide with that rubric can either be qualitative, like written comments, or quantitative, like a yes, no, or a check, yes, they have it, or no, they don't. When you think about using a single point rubric, we want to make sure you consider that this particular type of rubric does separate out each element you are assessing into its own row. And then it focuses on specific and actionable feedback on that particular standard because it lists what the passing criteria is, and then you can describe using the comments how they did above or below. It is a rubric that does focus more on learning process and not just a grade, and it is often used for formative feedback for that reason. When you think about using a single point rubric, it takes less time to develop it because you only have to define what you're looking for. But then it sometimes takes more time to grade because you need to provide feedback in a narrative form, typically about how they did and why they got what they did. Here's an example of a single point rubric for a care plan assessment that you can see has the criteria in the center. And what they've done here is they've listed the criteria and the description of what is considered competency in the middle. And then they've used two columns on either side to describe in comments and feedback what could be improved or what went well. This is particularly useful as a visual because you can rifle through everybody's rubric and kind of see visually, is the student above or below or struggling or not, based on where the comments are written in each of the boxes. So it's a nice style to separate out the good from the needs improvement feedback. And our last rubric type then today is the holistic rubric. And this, as we go back to that gaming theme, is like a performance in a single player campaign based on your final score. While the score considers factors like the enemies you defeated, the items you collected, the time you took, how many dots you ate, it doesn't provide details on how well you performed in each of those aspects. It's just a score at the end. So if we think about Guitar Hero, it's like the standard scoring system in that game. You receive a final score based on your overall performance. A high score might indicate good performance, but it doesn't reveal the details about your strengths or your weaknesses. And similarly, a holistic rubric considers various aspects like your accuracy, star power, activation, etc., but provides a single overall grade. So think about this. Have you ever designed an assignment that you needed to give just a level of performance grade like A through F or honors pass or fail? If so, a holistic rubric might be a good fit for that assignment. When we look at our rubric Rockstar game, we made a holistic rubric for it. And again, you see those same 3 criteria that we are assessing for the game. But now the descriptors include everything that you need to do to be a rubric Rockstar in one box. So in order to get that highest rating, you'd have to do all the things in that descriptor box. So it's 1 score, 1 letter, 1 number, 1 description, and that's it. And that's probably what many of us are most used to as far as grading goes. We're used to just getting an A on a paper or getting a numerical percentage score. So this most closely aligns with what I'd call more traditional grading, and often people call it a grade sheet as well. Because all the criteria are considered together to get your score. So to recap, it's a single scale, 1 score, letter, number, description, etc. That's all considered together to give you that grade, which is why we do call it a grade sheet. If you're considering using a holistic rubric, you need to consider the fact that each level has discrete performance levels. So you know which row or which level to pick. Feedback might need to be more specific to actually explain the grade that they got, because they'll want to understand why they got the A or why they got a C or that kind of thing. If you're using a holistic rubric and you have multiple people grading the assessments, you probably need to do some training, because what I think an A research paper is might be different than what Dr. McLeod thinks is an A research paper. So you need to kind of define and come to consensus about what that means so that the grading is consistent across multiple graders. And in this case, if you're using a holistic rubric, there is definitely more time on the development, so you can figure out the discrete descriptions of those performance levels, but then it's usually quicker to grade because you just have to put like an A on the paper and you're done. Here's an example from literature of a holistic rubric, and we realize this is tiny text and we're not expecting you necessarily to read it all. But we're going to go into just a little bit more detail in just a moment. This particular rubric was actually designed to evaluate students' critical thinking in text or speaking, and it was used with nursing students to develop care plans for scenarios and to support their self-reflection. So if we zoom in a little bit on one of the items, this happens to be level 4. This is the best score, a strong score. The student consistently does all or almost all of the following things. And you can see here that there are 6 different categories of things that the student needs to do in order to become strong or get a 4 as their grade on this particular rubric. So today we've looked at 3 different types of rubric. And to stick with our gaming analogy, it definitely highlights that there are the 3 different types of rubric can be used for different kinds of purposes. That analytic rubric offers specific feedback on multiple individual performance metrics. The single point rubric, it's simple pass-fail based on achieving the basic goal or passing that level in a game. The holistic rubric considers various aspects of the learning together or aspects of the game together, but provides a single score for your overall performance. I'm going to pass it back to Dr. McLeod now to give us a little preview and explanation of the game.
All right, thank you. So I am back now to get us started with our game, Rubric Rockstar, as promised. Before we dive right into the game, I want to give you a little bit of kind of a bird's eye view of how Dr. McCulley and I designed the rubric that would be used in the evaluation of your performance in the game. That's part of using rubrics, is figuring out kind of strategically, how are you going to match the rubric to the assignment? So I want to give you a peek into how we did that with this. So as you might remember, Rubric Rockstar is a quiz game. So you're going to be showing some pictures of rubrics and asked to identify what type they are now that you've been introduced to them. So the first rubric that we created, because it took the most amount of time to create, was the analytic rubric. We put all our criteria on the left, and then we carefully thought through what would be mastery, proficient, or developing for each of the criteria. It took a lot more time on our end because we were having to define these really carefully. It has the most detail because of that for you all as the ones who are going to be self-assessing your performance. We liked that it doesn't require any additional written feedback, that you as self-assessors in this case are really just having to, circle or put a mark next to whatever level of achievement you get within each of the 3 criteria. However, we did think about the fact that although it's pretty quick for you to, physically maybe mark which level you perform in each of the criteria, it will take a little bit of extra time for you all as the self-assessors to read through each level and maybe think through which one fits you best. And having to do that 3 times might end up taking a little bit longer than we have in our space together today. So ultimately, we decided not to use this as the self-assessment tool for our game. So next, we created our single point example that Dr. McCauley introduced you to a moment ago. We put just the proficient level in that column on the left-hand side, and then just left open-ended space for feedback. We liked that we thought that something that was really good about this rubric was that it kind of fit into our gaming theme a bit because it shows you exactly how to win the game or be successful in the game. So it would be really easy for you to read that and be like, oh, yep, I did it, or I didn't do it. But then kind of the issue here with the single point rubric is that in order to then give any feedback or self-assess, then there would be the task of writing in comments. We thought, first of all, that would be not very time efficient considering our time together today is brief. But also we thought about the logistics of this online environment. How would we get that link to you? It just didn't make a lot of sense for the assignment, the game that we have for you today. And so our last option was the holistic example. So in this example, kind of the overall learning is captured and the overall understanding is captured in just one box. We liked that this really allows for, in the end, for you to decide, based on your performance in the rubric, what level of achievement you got. We thought that kind of aligned well with our instructional goals of designing a game. This was a rubric that kind of more fit that game scoring type design. We also really liked that this was very quick for you to self-evaluate. In the end, hopefully you will leave being able to, or at the end of the game, you'll hopefully be able to just quickly figure out where you fit because you've seen this rubric already. All right, so I'm going to show you the rules of the game, but give you just another moment here to read over the holistic example, because as you now know, this is how you will be self-assessing at the end of this presentation, or at the end of this game, rather. That's an important kind of tip with using rubrics with students, is to make sure they have the rubric before they begin the assignment so that they can really use it to their full advantage to be able to be successful on the task. So hopefully you do feel like you will be successful, because we are now going to move into our game, Rubric Rockstar. We're going to show you a picture of a rubric, and then in the chat, if you are up for it, we ask you to put either an S, H, or A for if you think it's a single point, holistic, or analytic rubric. We're going to leave this key up here on each of the slides, so no need to memorize that right now. And again, it's very low stakes. In the end, you're self-assessing, so hopefully you'll give it a shot with us. Here's our first rubric. It's a sterile tray setup rubric. The left-hand side has 4 criteria for organization, aseptic technique, and so on. And then the top row has 3 levels of achievement with descriptions for each one below it. And if you named that this was an analytic rubric, you are correct. This would be really quick. In this case, this is a sterile tray setup likely some kind of performance task where an observer is watching students and grading them as they watch. And so this would be really quick, right? To just kind of circle each box to be able to have your eyes as the observer, mostly just on students doing the task. Maybe an issue here is that then there's not space to add any other feedback, any expansion of feedback or ideas about why one particular level of achievement was circled versus another. That could be added, maybe not. Just depends on if it's a good fit for the assignment. We're going to move in now to another rubric. You'll notice this is still that sterile tray setup rubric, but it's just a little bit different in its setup. Now we have criteria on the left side, and in the center, there's a proficient level description with a feedback column on the right. And this is a single point rubric. A big clue in for it to be single point is that it really only describes in the center or on the left-hand side somewhere the proficient level. It only names how to be proficient, how to pass. So notice that the nice thing about this rubric is that it gives that space for feedback about how the student did. That might be really beneficial for something like a sterile tray setup that is going to need to be perfected by a student as they're going to need to take it and use it clinically for the rest of their careers. Or that might not be important. It might be more important to just quickly be able to grade the task. It's really whatever fits best as the person creating the rubric. All right, Dr. McCulley is going to take us into another example.
So here you see a medical history taking rubric. So take a moment to notice that we have places for comments on either side of the criteria column that's in the middle. And then assess if you think it is a single point, holistic, or analytic rubric. If you wrote that it was a single point rubric, you are correct, because this assignment is, again, another performance task of a patient encounter, and this rubric separates out the areas for growth or areas of excellence visually using those comment columns, and it does provide that formative feedback to students, and in this case doesn't necessarily need to result in a grade. It does take a little more time to provide that individual written feedback to each of those criteria, so you do need to consider that as you decide which rubric is the best fit for your assignment. Here is another example of a rubric for a medical history taking task. So take a moment to assess if you think this is single point, holistic, or analytic. And if you said it's holistic, you're correct. In this case, this holistic rubric is fairly quick to grade because the content experts that would be watching the students do the medical history taking exercise know what a good medical history looks like or sounds like. So all they have to do is pretty much circle what they think is the score. It could be difficult to score, though, if you have a student that performs at different levels for each of the criteria. So, for example, what if a student gets all of the relevant info in there, but forgot to greet the patient? Because then you might have to give them, say, a 2.5, for example.
This last set of examples are all class presentation rubrics. So the first one has criteria along the left-hand side. In the center, it has 3 columns, HPF, honors, pass, fail. And then it has a space for comments on the right. Go ahead and guess single point, holistic, or analytic. And this is a single point rubric, although it might look a little bit different than some of the other examples we've shared so far today. That's the beauty of rubrics, is they don't all look the same and they are all customized to the assignment. So in this case, the center columns for honors, pass, and fail were added. Perhaps the department requires that at the end students get that feedback in that way, but you still want to be able to give comments more freely. This might be a good way to go about that. The comments on the side may or may not have anything to do with the grade. that students receive, they might just be additional feedback to students. And then the center columns might then equate to a grade in the end, or they might just be kind of giving students an idea of how they performed or where their performance landed them on this particular task. It might take a little bit more time to provide that individualized feedback, but then those center columns are much faster for the instructor to use. Here's another example. Criteria are still on the left, comments are still on the right, but the center column now, instead of honors, pass, and fail, has points 1 to 5. This is also a single point rubric. It provides only that proficient criteria on the left, provides that space for comments on the right, but now in the center, if you have an assignment where, say, you really need to give a score or a grade at the end, this might be a good way to kind of venture into the world of a single point rubric while still maintaining that more traditional grading style. The points could be awarded and totaled at the bottom, or again, they might just be kind of informational. They might not eventually lead to a grade. What is going to be important if you were to use a rubric like this is to really understand as the grader what that 1 through 5 looks like for student responses, and also make sure that students are clear in what constitutes a 1 through 5 and why it is they might have received, say, a 4 versus a 5 on a particular criteria. That's something that might be accomplished, maybe through when you're passing out the assignment and the rubric, kind of talking through and defining, maybe even collaboratively, what constitutes a 1 through 5. And that might be pretty simply accomplished through that conversation. However, say you pass out this rubric or you start creating this rubric and you think to yourself, I'm having a lot of trouble distinguishing 1 through 5 and keeping track of them. Then maybe that's a time to then turn this then instead into an analytic rubric where you're dragging out 1 through 5 and defining each one for each criteria. It becomes a little bit more work on the instructor's end, but then more clearly defines those levels. Either way could work. It's really just thinking through how can I best fit the needs of the assignment and what I have maybe time to do or what I want to accomplish through this evaluation. And this is our last round here of Rubric Rockstar. Again, a class presentation rubric. This time the left column has letter grades, A, B, and C. And then the row on the right of each letter grade then describes all the criteria in one space for each level. And this is a holistic rubric. It's a great way if you do need to give, say, a traditional letter grade to students. This is a great way to still use a rubric, but still incorporate that more traditional letter grade style. Something just to note, a formatting note on this one to highlight is that you'll notice in each box, bold the words slides, content, voice, and sources. Those are our 4 criteria that have been consistent with this type of or with these rubrics. And by bolding them in each of the levels, we kind of hope to draw students' attention to the 4 criteria so they can kind of track that across the 3 different levels, A, B, and C, and really carefully figure out, well, what is it that I need to do to make my slides an A versus a B? All right, well, we are, as I said, now finished with our Rubric Rockstar game. We do hope you enjoyed it. We still have a little more information to share, so we ask you to stay with us, but do want to give you a moment to self-assess and score your work in Rubric Rockstar. And we're going to keep moving on here to review and recap what we've done already, but hopefully this was a nice quick way to evaluate your work using this holistic rubric for the game.
So to recap today, we did look at 3 different types of rubrics and talked about the level of effort involved in using those for creation and grading of analytic. And then deeply, we looked at single point and holistic as well. Just to recap, that analytic rubric is a scoring tool that breaks down the assignment or project into very specific parts and provides detailed criteria for evaluating each part separately. And then each skill or criterion gets its own score, giving you a clear picture of strengths and weaknesses across different requirements for that particular assignment. They do take the most time to create because you have to literally write out and define every single box. But they're quicker to grade because you just have to check the box or circle it to get the score. And before we move on to the single point, I just want to make another comment about a couple examples in the game that you thought were analytic, but they were actually other types. The reason they weren't analytic was because we literally didn't write out the sentences to describe what honors, pass, or fail was, or what a 1, a 2, 3, 4, 5 was. But if we had stretched out that grid and put in the sentences to describe what those meant, then they could have easily been converted to an analytic. So again, all these rubrics can be morphed into each other if you need that kind of detail. So for the single point rubric, that's the second one we looked at today, we can use this when we want to provide clear expectations for what is considered passing, and then focus on individualized feedback for the improvement of that student's progress, rather than just assigning levels of achievement within a rigid grading scale. A single point rubric is very quick to create because all you have to do is describe the proficient level or the passing level, but then it can take more time for grading because the feedback is what becomes critical there to help the student know what they need to do to continue to learn and improve. And then the last rubric we looked at today is the holistic rubric. And a holistic rubric is a good fit when you want to assess understanding and achievement overall, rather than break down the points or specific details. So a holistic rubric is really somewhere in between the other two as far as time commitment, because you do have to spend some time considering different levels of performance and describing them. But you also may still need to provide that written feedback to explain the grade so that the students understand why they got the grade they did. So as we think about all three of these rubrics, the bottom line is that you can use any rubric on any type of assignment where you want to provide clear guidance to your students, and which type is really up to you, based on the level of effort to design and to grade that you are willing to put in, and the overall objectives for the assignment or the assessment that you're doing. So today we chose the holistic rubric as ours that we used for the game because we knew it fit best for the time we had and our goals for the game that we played. So some quick tips for leveling up your evaluation with rubrics. Remember that rubrics make clear where the bullseye is for your students so that they know what they need to do in order to be successful. If you are using rubrics with multiple graders, make sure you work together to norm them so that everybody agrees what the proficiency score is, or what a 3 is, or what an A is, or whatever the leveling is on your particular rubric. Definitely be ready to revise your rubrics over time, because as soon as you use a rubric, you'll say, oh, this is perfect. I've got this pinned down, and then you grade with it and you realize, no, wait a minute. There's this particular submission from a student, or this observation that I did was not quite matching up to what I expected in the rubric. So then you tweak it over time. And then one of the benefits of rubrics is that when you create these, when you pass your course on to other faculty, they also then have a clear picture of what is expected in that course or for that particular assignment, because the rubric is defining that for them too. So it helps consistency across our programs. If you decide to use AI to create rubrics, because you certainly could do that, we would recommend that you use the AI tools to brainstorm ideas for phrasing for those particular criteria, for example. but always proofread, because we've seen some examples where it sounds good, but then when you dig into the details, there are things in the rubric that don't quite match up to your objectives or your goals for that particular assignment. And then make sure that you consider the time commitment involved in both creation and grading so that you pick the rubric that fits best for what time you have when you design and implement those rubrics. So today, I hope we have been able to meet these goals for you. Just as a quick recap again, we've defined what a rubric is as an evaluation tool that's used to measure student performance against a consistent set of criteria. And we can use those rubrics to evaluate a variety of assignments and to define what success looks like for students so that they can be successful and get the feedback they need to continue to learn and be motivated to learn throughout the course that we teach. We talked about 3 different types of rubrics: analytic and holistic and single point. We focus mostly on single point and holistic because we have a separate brown bag on analytic. So remember, those single point rubrics are the quickest to create, but they require more time for grading due to the need for individualized feedback. And a holistic rubric is a good middle ground, but it also may require additional feedback to explain the grade. The best type of rubric that you use depends on the instructor goals, on your goals for the assessment and the amount of time that you have available to actually provide feedback in the grading process. Our references are on the slide for you to take a look if you're interested in reading more.
Thank you for watching today's Teaching with Technology Brown Bag session. You can view all Teaching with Technology Brown Bags on the USU YouTube channel under the full ETI playlist. Have a nice day.